Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 Garden Hour series for December. We are so glad you're here. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we have reached over 83,000 gardeners just like you. We are excited to announce that Garden Hour will continue in 2025. Our first webinar will be Wednesday, January 8th. More information on the topics and registration will be coming out soon. Keep an eye on our Garden Hour website for more information. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Calla Edwards, and I am the horticulture agent for Butler County. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or a related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom for questions related to the presentation. This is where our Q&A host will look for questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. You should see a button that says Q&A. Click on it, and you will be able to enter your question. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will post it to our Kansas State Garden Hour website. We also typically upload additional resources related to each topic as well. So anything that has been shared through the chat will also be linked to our website. Our website is also where you have access to previous topics and upcoming topics on the series. Our moderators today are Anthony Reardon and Laura Phillips. They will be sharing information through the chat during the presentation, and they will also help us facilitate the Q&A portion of this webinar. Today's topic is home hydroponics, and I am very excited for the idea to continue gardening in the winter. Our presenter this month is Lane Wiens. Lane is the horticulture agent for Shawnee County. Please give us just a couple minutes as we transition slides.
All right, thank you for that, Calla. Let me get things up and running here. All right, looking good? All right, no one's saying anything, so I'm just going to get started. Hi, thank you for being here with us, everyone. My name's Lane Wiens, and I am the Shawnee County Horticulture Extension Agent. Excited to talk with you guys today about hydroponics. So first up, what exactly is hydroponics? So it's a method of growing plants without soil. So soil always provides the nutrients and the structure that plants need to grow, but in hydroponics, we don't have that. So everything related to the plant growing, the nutrients, the structure, everything that soil would be doing is something that we have to provide ourselves. Hydroponic principles have been used throughout history. It's said that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon used some hydroponic systems in those gardens. And the Aztec people of Central America had a system called chinampas, where they made these floating rafts on the marshy area that they lived in to let them produce food for their people. Hydroponics today was developed in the late 30s from plant nutrition studies. So scientists were looking at what nutrients were necessary for plant growth and what amount they needed and when during their growth cycle the plants needed those nutrients. And that sort of morphed into growing plants without soil. And hydroponic principles were used in World War II on the Pacific Islands to grow produce for soldiers, excuse me. Shipping produce was really expensive and not possible. They would have grown in the soil, but the islands they were on had thin, rocky soil. So they grew hydroponically. So this is a picture from Ascension Island in the Pacific, and they're growing cucumbers with volcanic rock as the medium for growing. Hydroponics today. So as of 2019, a study from the National Ag Statistics Service The US grew 210,000 tons of produce hydroponically, which is valued at more than $700 million. This is a great graph. It shows where most of that produce comes from. So obviously the darker the state, that's where more of that comes from. So California, Texas, Colorado, Tennessee are kind of our heavy hitters. Kansas, we did grow a bit though, 58,500 tons as of that study, which if you think about how focused Kansas is on row crop production, the fact that we grew that much is crazy. Hydroponics is fantastic because we can use it to grow produce in unused or abandoned infrastructure that contributes to a local food system. So roofs of buildings are a fantastic place to put a hydroponic system, and they're even starting to do this in some of the bigger cities here in the country. So Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, there's companies that their whole thing is they grow produce on top of those high-rise buildings there. And we can take abandoned warehouses and retrofit them and turn them into these plant factories, which just have banks and banks of these several story hydroponic systems that can contribute quite a bit of fresh, locally grown produce to the food system. And finally, I think this is just absolutely fascinating is NASA is using hydroponic principles to grow produce in microgravity. So as we start looking at moving people to the moon or Mars, we're going to have a way to grow fresh produce for them on the journey and once they get to those places. So what are some of the benefits of hydroponics? Well, first up, the plants actually grow faster with hydroponics. So because all of the nutrients and things that they need for growth are right there, they can grow and take up those nutrients more efficiently. We lower water use through using hydroponics up to 90% in some cases, depending on the type of system that you're using. And as water becomes a more and more hot button issue, hydroponics is the way to get around that. We're able to grow crops more densely. So because unlike soil, we can't really go vertical with it, but with hydroponics, we are able to grow on some A-frame type structures, which are a lot more space use efficient, and we're able to grow more crops in the same square footage. We're able to grow crops regardless of weather. Kala kind of hinted about that a little bit earlier, but this is a picture from a project I did with a local mental health organization here in Topeka. And we're transplanting seedlings into a hydroponic system with snow on the ground. So it's a fantastic way to garden all year long. And lastly, no weeding. No soil means there's no weed seeds or anything like that, so you don't have to weed your hydroponic garden. So what can we grow hydroponically? I think the two that most people think of when they think hydroponics are herbs and leafy greens. So basil, dill, chives, mint, oregano, and lettuce, spinach. Ooh, leafy greens. There we go. Lettuce, spinach, kale, the pak choi, bok choy, cabbage. All of those grow really well in hydroponic systems. We also have fruiting crops like tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and squash that grow really well hydroponically. And actually, tomatoes, looking back at that study from the National Ag Stats Service, tomatoes made up about 60% of the hydroponic produce grown by pound. It was, again, 60%. Strawberries grow fantastic in hydroponic systems. And root crops, interestingly, can grow well in hydroponic systems. Here in the States, it's not really used too much. Most of our potatoes are still field grown, but there is research being done in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia where there isn't a lot of arable land where they can produce these really calorically dense foods. And there's lots of cities, so they're looking at using different medias and figuring out what varieties work and what nutrient solution they need to use. And finally, at K-State, we always stress right plant when we're out in the landscape. This is kind of the same concept. So different systems fit different crops better. So a system that can grow dill really well isn't necessarily going to be an ideal for growing tomatoes. So it's important to match your system to your crops and vice versa. So some common variants of hydroponic systems, we have the nutrient film technique, deep water culture, a wicking system, ebb and flow beds, aeroponics, and a Beto or Dutch bucket. And I know I went through those really fast, but we're going to go through the ins and outs of each of these types of systems and some ideas on how to build one at home a little bit later. Another really interesting variant of hydroponics is aquaponics, and this is a method of using fish waste products as fertilizer for the plants. So in theory, you can have two salable products from the same system, the fish meat and the produce that they create. So the fish live and eat and create waste in these retention tanks, and that waste gets pumped through several layers of solid filtration and other filtration where there's beneficial bacteria that break down that fish waste from an inorganic form that an organic form that the plants can't use or I have that all backwards. They make it inorganic. And that's what the plants are able to use. So it creates an ecosystem between the fish, the bacteria, and the plants to have a really nice system. So the components of building a hydroponic system at home. Most notably, we have our nutrient solution and our retention tank. We need that nutrient-rich water that the plants are going to need to grow. And of course, we need something that's going to hold that water. We need a place for the plants to grow. So a substrate, it might be a channel in some cases, it might be a bed. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Most hydroponic systems are done inside, and I'd be willing to bet that not a lot of you have a greenhouse at home that you can grow hydroponically in, so we need to think about a light source for these plants. Of course, if we're going to grow plants, we need the plants themselves, and depending on the system, we'll need a water pump or an aeration source. And of course, it wouldn't be talking about growing produce without talking at least a little bit about making some kind of integrated pest management to stop problems before they really get started. So first up is your retention tank. And your retention tank really only needs to do two things for you. It needs to hold water and be easy to sanitize. If it can do those two things, it is a prime candidate for a hydroponic system. Sanitation is going to be really important as we talk about hydroponics because we don't have the soil there, and that can act as kind of a buffer for different issues, but we don't have that. So we need to be able to clean out our system and sanitize it really, really well. So common types of retention tanks, storage totes work really well. Depending on how big your system is, a 5-gallon bucket will work fantastically. If you want to just go way off the deep end, a livestock watering tank is a fantastic option for a hydroponic retention tank. And of course, there's DIY options. You can build a little wood box and line it with plastic. That's a retention tank for hydroponics. And one last thing, I would recommend marking your water volumes as you fill up your tank. And we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. So if you're using something like a 5-gallon bucket, I would recommend marking your water volumes every gallon with something like a wax pencil or tape, something that you know what those given volumes are. And on something like this 27-gallon tote, every 5 gallons would probably be good. All right, nutrient management. Onto the nutrient solution itself. It's kind of a two-part piece. So we have our nutrients and our pH that we have to talk about. So like I said earlier, all of these nutrients have to come from the nutrient solution itself. And luckily for us, there's lots of commercially available fertilizers, and they can be pretty crop specific. So they might have a tomato blend or a leafy green blend or an herb blend. So that's great. The thing to keep in mind is you can grow lots of different crops in the same hydroponic system, but different crops are going to have different nutritional needs. So grow things with the same nutrients that they need in the same system. When it comes to adding nutrients, as always, read your label. There's going to be something it's usually a volume of nutrient concentrate to gallons of or volume of water if it's a liquid type fertilizer, and if it's a weight or a solid fertilizer, it's going to be a weight of that fertilizer salt per a volume of water. So it might be 2 ounces per gallon of water, which is why it's important to mark those on your retention tank as you fill those up. So if you have a 25-gallon tank, and it's 2 ounces per gallon, you would put 50 ounces of that fertilizer concentrate to properly get the right amount of nutrients for that tank. And replacing lost nutrients, so that water volume is going to go down over time. So we have to put those nutrients back in, add water back in. And this is another place where having those water volumes marked on is really important. So we do what's called loss replacement on hydroponics. So if we fill that system back up with 15 gallons of water, we need to add the same amount of nutrient back. So still using our 2 ounces per gallon, if we add 15 gallons of water back, we would put in 30 ounces of that nutrient concentrate to refill that water. pH management. Again, it wouldn't be a gardening webinar without talking a little bit about the pH of the system. So for hydroponics, maintaining a pH between 5 and 6.5 is going to be the proper range for most crops. I would be willing to bet that nowhere in the state of Kansas will you find your source water magically comes down to that 5 or 6.5 range. So we have to add different things to make sure that pH is within that range. So if your pH is high, so it's neutral or basic, we can add things like citric acid, vinegar, or products called pH down, which bring the pH back down into this range. And if you overshoot that, there's products that can bring your pH back up, like potassium hydroxide, potassium carbonate, and products called pH up, which again, bring that pH from super acidic back to that range we're looking for. And it's important to add these products that manage the pH slowly. I'm talking drips at a time. Soil acts like a buffer when it comes to pH, which stops how much a certain amendment can affect the pH. But we don't have soil here. We don't have anything that's going to buffer our pH. So we need to add these products slowly. All right, hydroponic substrates that we're growing in. There's lots of fantastic options. Most of the time, we're looking for things that aren't going to break apart into a lot of pieces. When we're trying to move water around and drain things, little pieces blocking things up isn't usually a good idea. So we have things like rock wool, which looks kind of like fiberglass insulation. They take basalt rocks, superheat them, spin them like cotton candy, and compress them into these little cubes and bales that work really well as a hydroponic substrate. If you're into houseplants, you might know this next one, LECA, lightweight expanded clay aggregate, or hydrotones, another name for that. That one's really good. It doesn't bring a lot of nutrients along for the ride, but it's there mostly to just provide structure for the plants. Coco coir, especially in these little fabric pods like this, are fantastic for hydroponics. So that's a waste product from the coconut production industry. It's all the brown stringy bits on the outside that, again, we don't really want plugging up our hydroponic system, but in these fabric pots, it works great. And perlite, which is the white stuff that you see in commercial potting mixes, works great as a substrate for hydroponics. And of course, we're oftentimes going to need something that's going to hold all of these things together, which is where these net pots come into play. They're just there to hold everything together, and they can also help hold plants to a specific height in your system. So they come in a variety of sizes. I think I found things all the way from a couple inches all the way up to about 8 inches wide. So that's borderline a bucket at that point, but they work really well for hydroponics. Lighting. You don't really have to reinvent the wheel. LEDs and work lights are affordable options, and you can find them pretty much everywhere. They work fantastic. Couple of things with lighting is the amount of light is going to depend on the stage of development and the crop that you're growing. So different crops need different amounts of light. So seedlings need the most at 16 to 18. Greens and herbs need 12 to 14, and fruiting crops need 14 to 16. Now, if you're kind of forgetful like me, this is the perfect time of year to be getting your supplies together to build your hydroponic system because Christmas light timers work fantastic for timing intervals that grow lights need to be turned on. So if you need a 16-hour interval for your seedlings, have it come on at 6 in the morning, have it shut off at 10 at night. That is 16 hours. You're perfect. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that lights need to be closer to the crop than you think they do. So seedlings, 4 to 6 inches from the bottom of the light is recommended. Greens and herbs and the fruiting crops is 6 to 12 inches. And it's important to raise those as time goes on. So if you have a 3 inch tall tomato seedling, you want the bottom of your light to be about 7 inches off of the ground and in a range up to about 9 inches. So something else to keep in mind with your lights. Starting seeds. We have a fantastic garden hour from a couple years ago on seed starting. I think Anthony's going to send that in the chat for us. But starting seeds for hydroponics looks pretty much like it does for starting outdoor transplants, except we have a couple other substrates that we can use. So this is again from that project here in Topeka. We're using rock wool to start our seedlings for the hydroponic system. So rock wool is kind of interesting. It's one that you want to make sure is fully saturated before you start putting plants in it. It's kind of like floral foam, and if you just dunk it, it's only going to be wet on the outside and it's going to have dry spots that are never really going to get fully saturated. So fully saturate your rock wool before you use it. But for starting seeds to keep our plants watered, we grew them in a solid bottom flat and we just kept about a 1/4 inch layer of water in the bottom of that. And we had fantastic luck with our germination. The other really great part about using hydroponic substrates is the seedlings will tell you when they're ready to be transplanted. So when you start seeing these little feeder roots coming out of the bottom of that rooting cube, that's when you know it's time that they're ready to go into the full-size system. Now you can use soilless substrate to start seeds for hydroponics, but there's a couple other things we have to keep in mind. It's really important to rinse off as much of that soilless media as possible before you put it in the system. That can, again, plug up the works when you're trying to drain and move water around your system, but it can also bring disease issues along for the ride. So it's important to get as much of that off as possible. And as far as transplanting, it looks kind of like uppotting a house plant, but with hydroponic media. So you would take your net pot, put a little bit of like your leca or your perlite or whatever you're using in the bottom, hold your seedling and kind of sprinkle that media in around to hold that seedling in place, and you're ready to go back into your hydroponic system. Pumps. So the size of the pump that you need for your system is going to depend on how big your system is and what kind of system that you're going to be growing in. And we'll talk which ones do and don't need a pump here in a little bit. Aquarium pumps work fantastic for growing hydroponically. Usually, I would say for most homeowners, about 30 gallons per hour is going to be more than enough. But there are adjustable gallon per hour pumps that are great for home use, and they really allow you to perfect things a bit. With pumps, we have to keep our head height in mind, which is the distance between the top of your nutrient solution in the retention tank to the height where that water is going to be coming out. Pumps get less efficient as you move that head height further and further up. So it might be able to pump 30 gallons per hour down here 1 foot above the system. But if you move that to 4 or 5 or 6 feet, you might be down to 15 gallons per hour at that point. So keep that in mind as you're designing your system. And with these pumps, it's important to always keep them submerged. Aquarium pumps are not meant to run dry. And it's actually a really common way to know when you need to top up your nutrient solution tank is when that nutrient solution starts to get lower and lower and start potentially drying out your pump. Aeration is another important consideration when it comes to hydroponics. Even though we're growing in water, our roots are still going to need to breathe, and the need for external aeration is going to depend on the type of system that we're growing in. And we add air into hydroponic systems with air stones and air pumps. So if you've ever been to the dentist office and you see the fish tank in the lobby and you see all of the bubbling going on, that's an air pump adding oxygen to the system for the fish. So we need to do the same thing in hydroponics for our plants. All right, let's get into a little bit of integrated pest management first off with our disease management. So as always, start clean and grow clean. Diseases that affect hydroponics like Pythium and Phytophthora come in through transplants and infested media. So it's really important to make sure that you're really carefully inspecting your transplants before you put them in your system And again, getting as much of that soilless media off as possible. Root pathogens spread really quickly through hydroponics. With all of the roots sharing the same pool of water, it doesn't take much for it to start on one and move to every single other plant in your system pretty quickly. So it's important to utilize our IPM practices and be scouting for those kinds of issues. So things to look for, especially with things like Pythium, is we have these bright, bright white roots, and then all of a sudden they'll turn really shriveled and brown. We call that the rat tail. So that's a really good sign that that's been infected with Pythium, and you need to remove that plant, remove all of your other plants from the system, not throw them away. Check and see if they have that rat tail look going on. Drain your system, sanitize it, clean it really well, fill it back up. Usually that takes care of the problem. But if you keep seeing it over and over, that's a sign that you probably need to get more dissolved oxygen into the system for your plants. And again, thoroughly clean and sanitize your system between crops. Drain it, wash it with dish soap and water, let that drain, spray on a 10% bleach solution. That's a really great way to sanitize your retention tank and your channels and things for hydroponics. Unfortunately, we still have arthropod pests to worry about. The ones we kind of see most with hydroponics are aphids, thrips, mites, and whiteflies. A really easy recommendation I have for you is keep your hydroponic system away from your houseplants. Anybody that's grown houseplants knows that they're just a magnet for all of those little creepy crawlies. So keeping your houseplants away from the food that you're trying to grow for your family is a great place to start. And again, utilize those IPM practices. Look at all of the little nooks and crannies of the leaves, the underside of the leaves. Aphids and thrips and things love the underside of leaves. And you'd be really impressed at how much good just a hard jet of water from a spray bottle can do about getting rid of these pest issues. All right, now we're going to talk about some of the variants of hydroponic systems. So we're going to give you an overview of each of these system types, the main considerations for each of these, and then we're going to compare some commercial scale and home scale systems of each type. My goal is not really to give you guys plans for building each of these systems, just information to keep in the back of your head as you're looking at building your hydroponic system at home. So first up is the nutrient film technique, or NFT system. So the crops that grow really well in NFTs, leafy greens, herbs, and strawberries. And it gets its name from the constant 1/8 or 1/4 inch layer of water running over the roots. So we have our retention tank, the water gets pumped up to the top of the slope and drains back down with gravity back into our retention tank. So it's important to maintain that 1 to 3% slope so that water is constantly moving over the roots and doesn't make any stagnant spots. So this is a grow tower, or a tower garden, excuse me, and this is kind of a variant of an NFT system. So we have our retention tank down here at the bottom and the pump that puts everything way up to the top. And there's some plates on the top that spread the water out to the outside walls of the system. And then the water just drains down the side in that 1/8 or 1/4 inch layer of water back down into the retention tank. So this would be kind of a variant of an NFT. So some commercial scale systems, usually they have two different manifolds. They have the irrigation manifold that delivers water to the top of that slope, and the drain manifold at the bottom that puts it back in the retention tank, which creates our recirculating system. So usually there's only one line coming out of the retention tank into some flexible piping with spaghetti tubes or drip tubes going into the top of each channels, and they all drain down to the same pipe, which brings everything back together and into the retention tank. This picture shows the plant spacing that commercial hydroponic growers are looking at. So giving each plant optimum spacing lets them get as large as possible. And of all of the systems, this one is probably the easiest to grow vertical with. So here we have just banks and banks and rows of these A-frame style hydroponic systems. So they'll have their irrigation manifold somewhere over here that flows down and drains back into the retention tank and makes our recirculating system. So, some homeowner style systems I was able to find online. This one's really interesting. You're growing flowers in here, which is awesome, but it's just one big, long, continuous pipe. And that does not look like small PVC. That looks like it's probably 8-inch PVC growing in net pots. I can only imagine how big the pump is on a system like that to get water clear up to the top there. Gutters like you would put on your house lend themselves really, really well for growing in an NFT because they're already meant to move water in a layer. So they're fantastic, and oftentimes they come with covers that you can drill holes in and drop your net pots in to hold those plants just exactly where they need to be. And then this one, I really like how space use efficient this system is. It can't be more than 2 feet off of the wall, but it's growing really well. And they have their lighting system figured out. They have it for each of these layers so that there's not one set of plants that's going to be more in the dark than others. All right, the next system we'll talk about is a deep water culture. Another name for this is a floating raft. So the crops that grow well here are leafy greens and herbs. And of the systems I'm going to talk about today, this one's probably the easiest to set up and grow in. So in this system, the plants are going to be suspended in a nutrient solution. So this is the one system where external aeration is paramount to success in growing. So for a floating raft, these would be on a styrofoam plate that has holes drilled in it that's floating right at the top of the nutrient solution. But sometimes it's not, it's just like in the lid of a container. And that one, you're going to have to be a little bit more careful with your nutrient solution and the height of that nutrient solution. You'll have to keep that topped up a bit more. So here's some pictures of a commercial deep water culture system. And when I say deep water, it's not that deep. It's usually only about a foot or 18 inches deep. But you can see they're growing, it looks like 15 heads of lettuce on that one little piece of styrofoam floating in a system. And you can see just how much lettuce they're producing in a system like that. So now for the homeowner scales, again, this would be the style where you would have to keep that water topped up a bit more. And they have an air pump, which is fantastic. We love to see that with the deep water culture. Here's an itty bitty one, and that's a container that's probably 8 inches by 16 inches, and they're growing 6 pots of herbs for use at home. And here's an example of a floating raft. So this would be another one where it's really easy to DIY it. Build a wood box, cut a piece of styrofoam that's probably an inch on all sides inside that so it can sit and float with the nutrient solution. So that's a deep water culture. Wicking systems. So leafy greens and herbs are the vegetables we think about growing with a wick system. This one is another one that's really easy to set up and grow in. This one works by using rope or string or fabric to wick the water up into the root system of the plant that you're trying to grow. So you want something that's going to allow water to ascend via capillary action. So like a plastic rope or anything like that wouldn't be good to use in a wicking system. And this one's really easy to scale up and down. Now, this one's not used a lot on a commercial scale, but it is a fantastic option for home gardeners. So I wanted to make sure that I talk about it a bit. So here we have a really small scale version. We're using it to root some pothos cuttings, but it looks like they just took a 2-liter bottle, cut the top off of it, inverted it, added some kind of wick. It looks like they have some jute twine and maybe some fabric in here that goes up into the perlite that they're using as their substrate, filled it with a little bit of water, and you have a fantastic rooting system. And if you add some nutrients to that, you can grow just a little head of lettuce in a 2-liter bottle on your kitchen counter. And now this one reminds me more of like a container garden almost, because they have their nutrient solution tank here at the bottom, and this lid has holes in it that have some cotton cord running between the nutrient solution and the growing bed for the plants. And they're growing these in perlite and vermiculite, and they just looks like they kind of just broadcast seed lettuce over the top of that. So that's a fantastic way to grow a lot of lettuce in a really small area through a wick system. Next up is an ebb and flow or a flood and drain system. So finally, something that we can grow fruiting crops well with, but also leafy greens grow well in ebb and flows. And this is one that really lends itself to working well with containerized plants. So how it works, we have a pump in our nutrient solution that floods our growing bed and then drains it back out. And you might have to do that several times a day. And depending on the media that you're using in your growing bed, it probably a good idea to put on a filter. Like if you have this full of perlite, you probably want to have some kind of filter on there, or else all of that perlite's going to end up in your nutrients or your retention tank after a while. So here's our commercial examples. Looks like this grower is using an ebb and flow bed as a nursery system. So they're using this to germinate and grow their seedlings to where those roots are starting to get to the bottom of the cube, and they transplant them out from there. So these kinds of systems, this is our drain and our irrigation manifold built in one. So the pump pumps water through this. All of these channels that are cut into the bed make sure that water gets distributed uniformly across the entire crop. And then as soon as we cut power from that pump, all of that water is going to start draining back down into our retention tank. So this one's also used pretty commonly in bedding plant production to water just a massive amount of plants, a heck of a lot faster than some guy with a watering wand can do. So hydroponics. So this person looks like they cut the top of an IVC tote using that as their retention tank and floods this bed that they filled with leca. Looks like they're growing some herbs and some flowers and maybe a pepper there. But that would work really well. And again, you might have to do this a couple times a day to make sure that those plants are well irrigated. And here we have some containerized peppers and tomatoes. Slap a tomato cage on there and you're growing tomatoes with an ebb and flood system. Aeroponics, this one's really, really interesting. This is the system where we start getting our 90% less water use for hydroponics. So crops, leafy greens, tomatoes, and strawberries. And in this system, our roots are going to be misted with the nutrient solution. So the pump goes through these high pressure nozzles that spray all of the roots. This one's going to be one that's really easy to scale up and down depending on what size you need. And something to keep in mind is you want to make sure that your plant roots are getting hit from all sides, because as these roots grow down, it's going to block, if there's another plant over here, it would block this plant from getting any water. So it's important to have mist nozzles on all sides so you're not creating any dry pockets in your hydroponic system. So this is the system, the type of system that's used really commonly in those plant factories I talked about a bit earlier. And just, oh, look at how delicious the strawberries look growing in this aeroponic system. And here was a cutaway of an aeroponic system I was able to find. So they have their solution kind of just based down there in the bottom, and they're running water through that system to make a really fine mist across all of the roots for this. This is another system that would be really easy to build at home. So here we have a tote with holes cut to the perfect size to fit our net pots. And they're using some neoprene collars to make sure that that mist isn't going absolutely everywhere. So they make these collars to fit most sizes of net pots. They're circular, they're about a half an inch, 3/4 of an inch thick, but they work really well. They're kind of lily pad shaped, so they have a slit that goes down to the center, which is where you would kind of hold your tomato seedling or your pepper or your strawberry seedling there. And they're just misting those roots with water. And this is another one that can be used as a cloner. I've seen really good success with using these to clone woody plants. You just take out the fertilizer and transplant when those tree or shrub roots look really good and healthy. And the last system we're kind of going to go through is a Dutch or Beto bucket. And this is kind of the creme de la creme for growing our fruiting crops. So tomatoes, peppers, squash, all of those. So this system is using drip irrigation to target nutrient solution exactly where the plants need it. So they just have a drip line that runs and spaghetti tubes that come and give that water exactly to the plants where they need it. And then down at the bottom, there's usually a hole with a filter on it to make sure we're not taking our substrate along for the ride, to drain all of the excess water into our retention tank. So with a system like this, I'd recommend using a chunky media like leca or really chunky perlite, because you got to fill up a lot of space, and that's going to take a bunch of horticulture grade perlite to fill that tank. So here's our commercial system. So it looks like they're running their nutrient delivery and their reclamation pipes all together. So they're just running one pipe over the center with a couple spaghetti tubes going into each plant. And then down in the bottom, oftentimes these commercial scale ones are going to have some cutaways that fit different sizes of PVC perfectly. So that's a commercial Dutch or Beto bucket system. And the home scale system looks just about the same. We have our nutrient delivery line going in the back with our spaghetti tubes. And then they have their drain manifold bringing everything back to the retention tank. And it looks like this person is maintaining a really nice slope so that water is going to be draining back into the retention tank. So if you do decide to build your own hydroponic system, I have a couple recommendations for you. Number one, obviously keep things watertight. You would be surprised at how much water can drain just from one itty bitty little leak. So this is one of the hydroponic systems at the K-State greenhouses. They have a commercial scale system. And when I was the teaching assistant for this class, we would harvest this, we would take the spaghetti tube out, move the channel over here to the side so it was easier for us to reach, harvest everything, clean the system or clean the channel, sanitize it, put it back, and put back the spaghetti tube. Well, one night after we harvest, we forgot just one of these little drip lines back into the channel. And when we came back the next morning, we had pretty much drained a 700-liter livestock tank of all of that nutrient, which is not ideal, obviously, but it was a great teaching moment to make sure that you keep things watertight for the students. Don't permanently connect your PVC and different things together. The most permanent connection you should have would be Teflon tape if you have any threaded connections. Thinking specifically at a cleanliness and sanitation perspective, if you had a system like this would be a nightmare to clean and sanitize effectively if you had all of those PVC cemented together. But if you didn't, you could just pull everything apart, clean and sanitize everything really, really well, and put it back together and you're growing again. So again, don't permanently connect your parts together. And lastly, plastic parts are going to be best for things that come in contact with water. It's a product that doesn't degrade over time in contact with water, unlike wood and metal, which work really well for a frame. But again, if your system's not sealed properly, you're going to have issues into the future. Now, if you're like me and DIY is definitely not your style, don't worry. A lot of the big box companies like Walmart and Home Depot and Lowe's and Amazon have kits, hydroponic kits available for sale. Great time of year for that. Get the gardener in your life a small hydroponic system. They come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, everything from a commercial size system all the way down to something that's going to fit on their countertop. So pick what works for you. And some final thoughts here. Start clean and grow clean. Maintain that cleanliness as you grow your crop. Match your crop to the system that you're growing with. And keep an eye on your plants as they grow. They're going to need maintenance. You might have to modify your pH a bit, and you need to make sure that your nutrient solution tank is sitting at the right height. And most importantly, have fun with it. Hydroponics is a great way to garden regardless of the weather. So with that, I will turn it over to Q&A moderators for any questions you guys might have.
Thanks for all of that information, Lane. That was awesome. We've just got two questions right now, but if anybody else has questions, please go ahead and throw them in the chat so we can get to them. We've got a few minutes. First, somebody asked with the ebb and flow design, they didn't see an air stone. So does that design not need one, or was it just not on the slide?
Yeah, so ebb and flow systems, there is going to be a period of time where there's not really any water in the system, which allows air to come back in. It's really just the deep water culture that we really need to make sure we have that air stone for. It's not a bad idea for most other systems, especially if you're having a lot of root pathogen issues, but really important on the deep water culture and everything else, it's a good idea.
Awesome. So somebody has asked, can they order seeds now, knowing that it's not cold enough, and then freeze the seeds to keep them?
So they're talking about holding seeds for an extended period of time, or how? I'm kind of confused at the question, I guess.
Hold on, let me read it again.
Okay.
Can I order seeds not knowing that it's cold enough to freeze the seeds?
So there is kind of a threshold temperature that's recommended to keep seeds above so you don't kill the embryonic plant in there, and that's going to be about 40 degrees, which is the temperature that most people keep their fridge. So if you want to keep your seeds for an extended period of time, putting them in the fridge isn't a bad idea.
Awesome. Somebody asked about plastics breaking down and microscopic pieces being found in the water, and if they should be concerned about microplastics in their system.
For sure, yeah. Microplastics is a huge issue, and I'm actually happy to say that there is research being done at K-State on microplastic uptake in hydroponic crops. So there has been other research done, and from what I could tell from those, they were inoculating their system with so much microplastics that it actually like sliced up the roots and hurt the yield of the plants. So that's not really applicable in industry for commercial hydroponic growers. Obviously, they want to be able to produce crops, so they want to keep that microplastic uptake as low as possible. So it doesn't do them much good if they can't grow plants to sell.
So we've got two different questions that came in on pollination. Somebody asked, how does pollination occur without insects flying around? And yeah, somebody else also asked that same question.
Yeah, awesome. Fantastic question. So that really only comes into plays with fruiting crops like tomatoes and squash and peppers and strawberries, things like that. And like you said, we don't have insects inside that are going to help pollinate those crops. So for squashes and cucumbers, there's actually parthenocarpic varieties. Those are ones that don't require pollination to be able to set fruit. So look for some of those parthenocarpic varieties if you're looking to grow cucumbers. And for tomatoes and peppers, an electric toothbrush or a paintbrush works really well to pollinate those plants. It's kind of time consuming, but there's nothing like eating a fresh tomato in February. So yeah, it's a hurdle for sure, but something that we can get around pretty easily.
Awesome. And we've got two people who have asked if the nutrition is any different between outdoor kind of typical gardening versus hydroponic gardening, and if there is a taste difference in vegetables that are grown indoor versus hydroponics.
That is a great question. So as far as nutrient content, I would definitely have to do some more research. I'll try and track down a resource on that we can put in the website tomorrow. As far as taste, some of the best lettuce I have ever had came from a hydroponic system. And I don't know if it's just the different varieties that they're growing or the fact that it was growing hydroponically, but it was phenomenal.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Somebody asked if we have a good publication on home hydroponics through K-State.
So we have one. It's a little bit dated, but there's plenty of other universities that have some fantastic resources on growing hydroponically. Minnesota has some great stuff. Utah or New Mexico have some good stuff. So we'll definitely make sure to put those on the website for tomorrow.
Great. And then we've got a couple questions on lights. Somebody asked, they said, I read LEDs need to be higher above the plants than fluorescent lights. Is this true? And can you differentiate a little bit on those?
So that might be the case. It might have to do with the spectrum of light that those are putting out. So LEDs, we can get pretty color specific. So we might have some blue lights or red lights or a combination of both. I need to do some more research on that for sure. I'll try and include something for tomorrow.
And I would also say when you buy like a specific grow light, they usually have a graph that will show you distances and age of plants too that people refer to. Somebody asked, will an indoor hydroponic system impact the humidity in their house?
Ooh, it probably would a little bit, because if we have a volume of water, it is going to be evaporating and adding humidity to the house. Usually this time of year, that's not a bad thing. But in the summer, yeah, for sure, that could be a potential issue. And I would imagine that's probably going to be pretty localized within probably a few feet of your system. It's not like it's going to create so much humidity that it spreads all through your house.
Somebody has asked, what do you use to clean your hydroponic system with?
Cleaning it. So, toilet brushes work really well, especially for different sizes of PVC. Dish soap and water, that's always a great to get that clean. And then, like I said, 10% bleach solution is really great for getting any other little nasties that you might have missed in your sanitation process.
Somebody has asked, are there factors to consider for hydroponics that are inside in the winter, such as minimum temperature for your house, minimum humidity?
Yeah, so temperature is going to be a little bit of a factor, but luckily we usually hold our houses between 70 and 75 degrees or so, which is really great for plant growth. So temperature is not as much of a problem. Humidity is also not really a problem. I mean, it's hydroponics. There's a lot of water around, so you don't really have to worry about your humidity too much. But no, fantastic question though, for sure.
So kind of going off that temperature question, how does water temperature affect the plants?
Definitely. That is the temperature that really matters in hydroponics is the temperature of the water. So over time, your water is going to equilibrate out kind of with the temperature of the room. A couple of gardeners ago, someone said that water does retain heat really well. So it's going to take quite a while to get there, but it's not really something you have to worry about. And actually, some commercial growers will actually chill their water if they're growing like lettuce to it's, theoretically it's supposed to help with some disease issues, especially in those huge deep water culture systems, but you shouldn't have to worry about too much about the temperature of your water. As long as it's not below 60-65 degrees, you should be fine.
Awesome, thank you. Um, do you recommend threaded pieces since you're not going to glue them, or is there some other way that you recommend connecting pieces?
So yeah, great question. Threaded pieces work really well, especially if you're using like pieces of garden hose to move water through your system. Otherwise, PVC parts are designed to stick together watertight. It's just if you're building it like an irrigation system in your yard, you're never going to want those pieces to come apart ever again.
Mhm.
Hydroponics, we don't want that. So usually they're pressure fit enough that they'll hold water for you.
Awesome. Somebody says, I live in Colorado. Will my seeds freeze during delivery if I order them now?
Ooh, I'm not totally sure what the weather in Colorado looks like right now. They usually pack them pretty well. There's usually some kind of thermal something to make sure the temperature of those doesn't drop below a certain temperature. And usually they get those shipped out pretty quickly. So I wouldn't imagine there'd be much problem with that.
Somebody has asked, is there a certain kind of fish that you can include in your hydroponic
Yeah,
system?
so looking at an aquaponic system, so tilapia are kind of the gold standard for aquaponic fish. Other fish like carp, so goldfish are also carp, so they work well. But if you're trying to grow two products at the same time, we don't really eat carp here in the US. Bass also work okay for a hydroponic system. It's just really difficult to train them to eat the pelleted food. So tilapia are kind of the go-to, especially if you're looking at food production. There should be a resource from Texas A&M, I think, that Anthony put in the chat that has some great information on fish selection.
Awesome. Well, we've got just one last question right now. So if anybody else has questions, please throw them in. It's your last chance. The current question is, can you please discuss lumens and Kelvin versus LED?
Ooh, I will definitely have to find a resource on that one for sure. That's really can get pretty technical. And if you are using some kinds of light, they can give out some heat sometimes. So that's something that you'll want to keep in mind. And yeah, again, I'll try and find a resource for that.
We had one more question come in here. Somebody wanted to know, what is the harm if seeds do freeze during shipment?
So again, freezing temperatures could pull apart the little embryonic cells and things that are there in the seed. So obviously, a frozen seed isn't going to germinate very well. So that's the harm there.
Awesome. Well, that was the last of the questions that we have. So thanks so much for all of that, Lane. I'll hand it
Yeah,
back over to
thank
Kala.
you.
All right. Most of the time we have more questions that we have time for, but we are going to link all of the articles that were shared in the chat, plus potentially some additional resources to our website. Those resources should help answer your questions, but if you have additional information, be sure and contact your local extension office. Once again, thank you for joining our K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are so glad you could be here today to learn about home hydroponics. We are excited to continue offering this webinar series into 2025. Make sure to check your email and our website for more details coming soon, including topics and registration. So you can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view our recorded Garden Hour archive or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session was recorded and should be posted to the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you're going to receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out. We greatly appreciate your feedback and any information you can provide us. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at our email, which is gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you again. We hope you continue to tune in each month. You have a wonderful week.